They brought him in on a cargo sled because the extraction shuttle's medical cradle was too narrow for his frame. The proportions were wrong. Our cradles are built for Vorath, Sindesi, even the broad-chested Kaluni. But this human's shoulders jammed in the guide rails, and the recovery team gave up and laid him on a flat cargo sled with a thermal blanket and pushed him through the corridor like freight. I was a third rotation intake medic aboard Processing Station Yanara, Quarantine Division. My job was autopsies. When a biological is pulled off a Class 7 quarantine world, my job is to document cause of death, catalog tissue degradation, and file the remains under the appropriate xenobiological index. I had never, in 11 years of service, performed a living intake from a Class 7. The recovery officer, a Sindesi named Torith, stood in the threshold of my examination bay and would not come closer. The shuttle went down 41 local rotations ago, she said. Planet KV-0773, Class 7. Apex predator saturation in the 98th percentile. I knew KV-0773. Every quarantine medic did. The planet was sealed 300 years ago, after 4 survey teams went down in consecutive cycles. Nothing larger than a microorganism had survived the surface longer than 6 rotational days. The predators were pack hunters, low-slung, armored, thermal sensing, and they did not compete with intruders. They coordinated around them. 6 days was the record. 41 rotations, I repeated. Torith's inner membrane flickered, the Sindesi equivalent of a shudder. He was walking when we found him. Upright, carrying a bundle of cured hide over one shoulder. I pulled the thermal blanket down and began my scan. His vitals were stable, heartbeat low and steady, body temperature holding at a value our instruments flagged as abnormally constant, as though his internal thermostat refused to acknowledge external conditions. He was dehydrated but not critically, malnourished but functional. His boots were shredded to the ankle, rebound with strips of something fibrous and dark. His flight suit was missing below the waist, replaced by a crude wrap of layered animal hide stitched with thin cordage. He was awake. His eyes tracked me as I worked, but he did not speak. He had the look of someone who had stopped explaining himself long ago. I worked from the extremities inward, the way we are trained. Feet, blistered, calloused, 2 toenails gone, but no infection. Shins, scarred, 1 long shallow furrow along the left tibia that had healed badly, weeks old at least. Knees, functional. Right thigh, I found a deep bite scar, crescent-shaped, partially healed. The teeth pattern matched KV-0773's apex predators. The punctures had gone deep enough to threaten the artery. They had missed it by less than a centimeter. "You were bitten," I said. "Twice," he said. His voice was flat with disuse, like a machine that had not run in weeks. That one was the second. I moved to the arms. I found them on his left forearm, midway between the wrist and the elbow, and everything I understood about KV-0773 rearranged itself in my chest. 9 stitches, cross pattern, evenly spaced at intervals so consistent I could have laid a calibration ruler across them without finding a millimeter of deviation. The wound beneath had been a deep laceration, jagged entry, the kind made by a broken spar or a raw rock edge, not a clean blade. It had been serious, deep enough to expose the fascia, possibly the tendon sheath. Untreated, it would have cost him the use of that hand within days on a world like KV-0773, where the microbial load alone would have driven an open wound septic in hours. But someone had closed it. Each stitch was a precise cross, 2 diagonal passes forming an X, the kind of pattern used for deep tissue closure, where tensile strength matters more than appearance. I leaned closer. The suture material was not synthetic. It was fibrous, pale, slightly irregular in diameter. Organic. I tweezed a loose fiber from the knot tail of the 9th stitch and placed it under magnification. Bark. Stripped, soaked until pliable, and twisted into cordage no thicker than a Sindesi eyelash. And the needle, I reconstructed the puncture geometry and worked backward through the entry angles, had been a thorn, split along its natural curvature, beveled to a point, and hardened by heat. He had made a needle from a thorn. He had made thread from a tree. He had sutured his own forearm on a Class 7 world with materials he gathered between predator attacks. I set my instruments down. "Who closed this wound?" I asked, though I already knew. He glanced at his forearm as though he had forgotten about it. I did. With what? There's a thorn tree near the southern ridge. Dense wood, narrow grain. You split the thorn lengthwise along the seam and it holds a point. The inner bark peels in long strips if you soak it overnight in still water. He said this the way someone might describe repairing a shelf bracket. The thorn worked fine. I counted the stitches again. 9. I had been trained in field suturing at the Yanara Academy. 4 years of xenobiological wound closure. Hundreds of supervised procedures. Sterile instruments. Coagulant foam. Pre-threaded needles graded by tensile class. My instructors would have scored those 9 stitches at near clinical proficiency. He had done it in the dirt, with a thorn, while the microbial fauna of a Class 7 planet tried to eat him from the wound outward. You've done this before, I said. Not with a thorn. A pause. Not on myself. I looked at his face. He was not boasting. There was no pride in it, no performance. He was answering a medical question, and his tone said he considered the stitches unremarkable. A problem solved with available materials, nothing worth lingering on. I continued the scan. 3 cracked ribs on the left side, partially healed. A hairline fracture in the left clavicle, set with a crude splint fashioned from 2 straight sticks, and more bark cordage, bound tightly enough that the bone had knitted nearly true. Bruising in deep tissue layers that suggested repeated blunt force impacts spaced over weeks, consistent with close-range encounters with large fauna. A chemical analysis of his skin surface returned traces of compounds that matched the territorial scent markers of KV-0773's apex pack hunters. He smelled like them. I asked him about that. He said, if you wear the skin long enough, they stop flanking you from downwind. Takes about a week. They still come, but they come from where you can see them. Torith was still in the doorway. I could feel her watching. I turned back to the 9 stitches and ran the final diagnostic sweep. The wound beneath was closed, healed cleanly. No infection, no necrosis, no secondary complication. On a world where the ambient microbiological load alone should have killed him 6 times over, his improvised surgery had held. How? Torith said from the threshold, and did not finish the question. I understood what she was asking. Not how did he suture the wound. The technique, however improbable, was mechanically straightforward. She meant, how does a species do this? How does a biological crash on a planet that has killed every living thing set upon its surface for 3 centuries, take a predator bite to the thigh and a gash to the forearm, and instead of dying, which is what that planet is designed to guarantee, sit down, find a thorn, split it, strip bark, soak it overnight, and close the wound in 9 perfect stitches, and then keep walking for another 30 rotational days? I filed my intake report that evening. I have it archived still. I look at it sometimes. 41 rotational days on KV-0773. 2 predator bites. 1 deep laceration, self-sutured. Material: thorn and bark fiber, 9 stitches, cross pattern. 3 cracked ribs, self-splinted. He had eaten local fauna. Cooked, the chemical traces confirmed, meaning he had built fire, and had fashioned tools, clothing, shelter, and camouflage from the carcasses of the animals that hunted him. He had not hidden. He had not curled into a crevice and waited. He had mapped the terrain, marking routes on cured hide with a charred stick, and when the extraction shuttle finally located his emergency signal, he had been moving north, toward the denser predator territory, because he wanted to know what was there. There is a field on the intake form labeled prognosis. Standard entries for Class 7 retrievals include phrases like critical systemic failure, irreversible tissue degradation, or death confirmed, remains indexed. I had written, full recovery expected. Patient requests return of personal effects, including 1 sharpened thorn, which he identified as, and I quote, still good for another few stitches. The form has a second field near the bottom, labeled threat assessment. Torith, as recovery officer, fills it in before the subject reaches my bay. It is a paragraph field, designed for detail. She had written 1 word. I will not say what it was, but in 11 years of filling out that form for the dead, I had never once read an answer that made me consider locking the examination bay door from the inside. I looked at the human. He had closed his eyes. His breathing was even, his heartbeat unchanged from the moment they wheeled him in. 62 beats per minute. The same rate, I later learned, that his species maintains while sleeping. He was asleep, on a station surrounded by strangers who could have been anything to him. In a medical bay on a quarantine platform at the edge of charted space, 41 days after a crash that should have killed him before nightfall, he had closed his eyes, and he was asleep. The 9 stitches on his forearm rose and fell with each breath. Thorn and bark, perfectly spaced, still holding.